Silent Shadows, the story of a serial killer in India. It was a dark and stormy night in Mumbai, India. The city was already known for its crime rates, but this was something else entirely. A psycho serial killer was on the loose, preying on the poorest of the poor in the slums. The police had been trying to catch him for months, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. 13 poor people had already been murdered, and the city was in a state of panic. People were afraid to go out after dark, and parents were keeping their children locked up inside. The killer seemed to strike randomly, and there was no pattern to his murders. The psycho serial killer had a chillingly consistent pattern in his murders, which was a constant challenge for the police. He always targeted poor people living in the slums, selecting victims who were vulnerable and unsuspecting. Once he had chosen his prey, he would strike with a level of brutality that was difficult to comprehend. The killer always left a distinctive signature at the scene of the crime, as if he wanted to taunt the police and challenge them to catch him. He would leave a small, intricately designed symbol carved into the flesh of each victim, almost like a twisted calling card. Despite the police's best efforts, they were unable to find any meaningful leads on the killer's identity or motivation. His signature was the only consistent aspect of the murders, and it served as a constant reminder of their inability to solve the case. The killer seemed to take pleasure in evading the authorities, and he continued to strike with increasing frequency. The police were desperate for a breakthrough, and they knew they needed to act quickly before the killer could claim any more victims. The police were at a loss. They had no idea who the killer was or what his motives were. They had even offered a reward for any information that could lead to his capture, but no one had come forward. Finally, the police decided to take drastic action. They recruited an undercover agent to infiltrate the slums and try to find out more about the killer. The agent was a young man named Rohit, and he was known for his quick thinking and resourcefulness. Rohit spent the next 23 days living among the slum dwellers, trying to blend in and gather information. He pretended to be a rickshaw driver, and he picked up passengers at all hours of the day and night. He listened carefully to their conversations, trying to pick up any clues that might lead him to the killer. Rohit knew that the only way to catch the psycho serial killer was to understand his pattern of behavior. He spent long hours combing through the evidence and analyzing every detail of the murders in order to find a common thread. He visited the crime scenes and spoke to witnesses, trying to piece together a picture of the killer's movements and habits. He discovered that the killer only struck at night, and that he seemed to prefer certain areas of the slums over others. It wasn't easy. The slums were a dangerous and chaotic place, and Rohit had to be careful not to arouse suspicion. But he was determined to succeed, and he never lost sight of his goal. Rohit also noticed that the killer had a distinctive method of attack. He always targeted victims who were alone and vulnerable, and he used a knife to inflict brutal wounds. He seemed to take pleasure in causing pain and suffering, and he left behind a signature symbol at each crime scene. As Rohit continued his investigation, he began to develop a theory about the killer's motivation. He believed that the killer was driven by a deep-seated anger and a desire for revenge against society. He may have seen himself as a vigilant, punishing those who he felt had wronged him. Rohit's theory was confirmed when he discovered that several of the victims had been involved in criminal activity. The killer may have been targeting them as a form of vigilant justice, punishing them for their sins. During the 14th murder attempt, the killer made a critical mistake that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He had been stalking his prey, a young woman, who lived in one of the slums, for several days. He had studied her routines and habits, and he knew exactly when and where to strike. However, as he made his move, something unexpected happened. The woman managed to fight back, striking the killer in the face with a sharp object. The blow caught him off guard, and he stumbled backwards, stunned. In that moment of confusion, the woman seized her opportunity and ran. She darted through the narrow alleyways and twisting lanes of the slum, dodging trash heaps and stray animals as she went. She could hear the killer's footsteps pounding behind her, but she refused to give up. She pushed herself to the limit, running faster than she ever had before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman burst out of the slum and into the open streets. She stumbled and fell to the ground, panting and gasping for air. But she had made it. She was safe. As Rohit investigated the incident, he found a crucial clue that would eventually lead to the killer's capture. The woman had managed to rip a piece of cloth from the killer's jacket during their struggle. It was a small piece, but it was enough to provide a DNA sample that could be used to identify the killer. Rohit and his team set a trap for the killer. They positioned themselves in the areas of the slums where the killer was known to frequent, and they waited for him to strike again. Finally, after weeks of gathering intelligence, Rohit got a breakthrough. One of his passengers mentioned a man who was always seen lurking around the slums at night. The man was said to be tall and thin, with long hair and a wild look in his eyes. Sure enough, the killer made his move, and Rohit and his team sprang into action. After a tense struggle, they managed to subdue the killer and bring him to justice. When the killer was finally caught by Rohit and his undercover team, he was in a sorry state. He had been living on the streets, moving from one slum to another, trying to avoid capture by the police. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his hair was matted and unkempt. His face was gaunt and haggard, and he looked like he had not slept or eaten in days. Despite his physical appearance, however, the killer's eyes were sharp and alert. They darted around the room, scanning for any signs of danger or escape. There was a hint of defiance in his gaze, a sense that he was still in control, even in this dire situation. Rohit's success was due to his dogged determination and his ability to see the bigger picture. He understood that the key to catching the killer was to understand his behavior and his motivation, and he was relentless in his pursuit of that knowledge. His efforts paid off, and he was able to bring an end to the killer's reign of terror. After the police arrested the psycho serial killer, they found it extremely difficult to get any information out of him. He remained stubbornly silent, refusing to divulge any details about his motivations or his methods. The police knew that they needed to find a way to break him, and that's when Rohit had an idea. He remembered that his girlfriend Ananya was a skilled psychiatrist, and he knew that she might be able to get through to the killer. He contacted her and asked her to come and speak to the prisoner, hoping that she could get him to open up about his crimes. Ananya agreed to help, and she visited the prison where the killer was being held. She spent several hours talking to him, trying to establish a rapport and build trust. At first, the killer was unresponsive and hostile, but Ananya persisted, using her knowledge of psychology to probe deeper into his side. As the conversation progressed, Ananya noticed a change in the killer's demeanor. At first, he was hostile and uncooperative, but as she continued to talk to him, he began to soften. She could see the pain and hurt in his eyes, and she knew that there was more to this story than just senseless violence. After some gentle prodding, the killer began to open up to Ananya about his childhood. He revealed that he had grown up in the very same slums where he had been committing his crimes. His parents had died when he was young, and he had been forced to fend for himself on the streets. He had been subjected to all kinds of violence and abuse, and he had no one to turn to for help. As he spoke, Ananya could sense the depth of the killer's pain and despair. He felt that he had been abandoned by society and that he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He saw himself as a kind of vigilant, punishing those who he felt had wronged him and his community. Ananya listened patiently, offering the killer empathy and understanding. She knew that his actions were inexcusable, but she also recognized the pain and trauma that had led him down this dark path. She encouraged him to see that there were other ways to cope with his pain, and that he didn't have to resort to violence and murder to make a difference. As the killer spoke, Ananya could see that he was starting to change. His demeanor softened, and he seemed to be genuinely remorseful for what he had done. He expressed a deep desire to make amends and to find a new way forward. In the end, Ananya's intervention had made all the difference. By offering the killer compassion and understanding, she had helped him to confront the demons of his past and find a new path towards healing and redemption. It was a powerful moment, and one that would stay with Ananya for a long time to come. Thanks to Rohit and Ananya's efforts, justice was served, and the killer was finally held accountable for his crimes. But perhaps more importantly, a troubled soul was given a chance to heal and find a new way forward. The city breathed a sigh of relief. The killer had been caught, and the slums were once again safe. Rohit and his team were hailed as heroes, and the police department was praised for their ingenuity and determination.